Well, welcome everybody, and we are going to continue our series called 66 Books in 52 Weeks, and tonight we're going to cover two books, Jeremiah and Lamentations, and if you have your outlines, you can kind of follow along with that. Hopefully that'll give you some guidance as we go through this, and it also lists out all the scriptures that we go through and we read as well. So let's talk about the book of Jeremiah. First of all, Jeremiah is one of the major prophets, and we divide the major and the minor prophets simply by the length of the book that it is. And so Jeremiah is one of the longer books, and let me zoom this in here, that Jeremiah is 52 chapters in length, and it has it's the 24th book of the Bible, 52 chapters in length, and Jeremiah is he prophesied during the time leading up to the Babylonian conquering of Jerusalem, and through that as well. And so we'll see that more of that in a little bit here. Here's the structure according to those printed outlines. The ones you can download here is you have the this one divides it up into four sections here. The first section would be the naming of the gross sins of Judah, just listing everything out. And the idea is showing that God's judgment is not without cause. The second was judgments against Judah, again pointing out the sins of Judah and what God is going to do. And then there's a message of hope and deliverance. But then during this third section too, Jeremiah goes through some trials, and he is abused for his message. And then the fourth part of this is a really uplifting book. The people refuse to heed God's prophet or listen to him. So this is one of those sections of Scripture that's not one of the most happy times. As a matter of fact, it's one of the saddest chapters in all of the Bible. And continuing here, if we're going to see what a key verse, there's of course with 52 chapters, there's a lot to choose from. But I keyed in on this one because it has to do with Jeremiah, the man himself, the prophet himself, and his willingness to stay the course in the midst of not having anybody listen to him. And he says, "But if I say I will not mention his word or speak any more in his name, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot." So even though he wanted to quit, he just couldn't. He was a man of God. He had the message of God. And even though he was abused, people wouldn't listen to him, he still chose to speak. And I think that is a very telling verse there. It's a reflection of his character and the kind of man that Jeremiah was. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the background of Jeremiah. Now on your outline there, I think there's a few things you can fill in. The first one here is that Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet. He did not have a joyful ministry or a happy time in his ministry there. He was born as a priest just north of Jerusalem. Another thing we can see is that he was chosen to be a prophet before he was born and called to the office while he was very young. I'll read to you from Jeremiah 1, 5, and 6. "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Alas, sovereign Lord, I said, I do not know how to speak. I am too young." This was Jeremiah being called as a prophet here. So, and then he was commissioned by God, and this is verses 9 and 10 of chapter 1. "Then the Lord reached out his hand and touched my mouth and said to me, I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant." And so God was talking about the message that he would give to the nation of Israel and to other nations as well. So he began his ministry during the reign of King Josiah and was a mourner at his funeral. Now, if you remember that list of kings that we've used with the two columns there, and on the left-hand side of the column, you have all the southern kings, the kings of Judah, and there were some that were bad and many that were bad and some that were good. The last good king of Judah before the Babylonians came in and conquered them was Josiah. He instituted all of these religious reforms in the nation, and Jeremiah lived during his time, and then he saw the demise of the nation here. And I'll just read to you from 2 Chronicles 35:25. This is how when showing that Jeremiah was a mourner, Jeremiah composed laments for Josiah, and to this day all the male and female singers commemorate Josiah in the laments. These became a tradition in Israel and are written in the laments. Lament is a type of writing or a type of expression in literature. As a matter of fact, we're going to look at the book of Lamentations next. And so you can see where he was in the history of Israel. Something else, he was forbidden to marry because of the terrible times. God told him not to marry because of these terrible times that were going on at this time. Let me just read it to you here from Jeremiah 16, verse 1. Then the word of the Lord came to me. You must not marry and have sons or daughters in this place. For this is what the Lord says about the sons and daughters born in this land, and about the women who are their mothers, and the men who are their fathers. They will die of deadly diseases. They will not be mourned or buried, but will be like dung lying on the ground. They will perish by sword and famine, and their dead bodies will become food for the birds and the wild animals. These are horrible things that Jeremiah was aware of and was telling people, but part of his not marrying was a part of his message, giving the message to the people of Israel. Here's something there. You want to build, how do you measure the success of a servant of God? Well, today you might say, well, a servant of God, if they're successful, they're going to have a big church. And a lot of people like what they have to say, and a lot of people listen to them. Well, I don't think any of us here would say that Jeremiah was not a success in his life, but he never won a convert. He was rejected by his people. I'll read to you here, Jeremiah 18:18, just skipping around here. They said, come, let us make plans against Jeremiah, for the teaching of the law by the priest will not cease, nor will counsel from the wise, nor a word of the prophet. So come, let us attack him with our tongues and pay no attention to anything he says. So that was the kind of pool he was swimming in, to try to speak the truth, and yet he's going to be attacked for it. On top of that, he was hated, beaten, put in stocks. Let me just read this to you from Jeremiah chapter 20, verses 1 and 2. When the priest of Pashur heard of Immer, the official in charge of the temple of the Lord, heard Jeremiah prophesying these things, he had Jeremiah the prophet beaten and put in the stocks at the upper gate of Benjamin at the Lord's temple. So here's a prophet of God speaking the truth, and these were religious leaders. They took him and put him in stocks. They didn't want to hear what he had to say. He also was imprisoned, and he was charged with being a traitor. In Jeremiah 37, 15 and 16, they were angry with Jeremiah, had him beaten and imprisoned in the house of Jonathan the secretary, which they had made into a prison. Jeremiah was put into a vaulted cell in a dungeon where he remained a long time. Again, if he got into it for the perks of being in ministry, he didn't get very many perks. He was a servant of God, but he was hated for it. His message broke his own heart. This is a heartbreaking verse here, Jeremiah 9:1. Oh, that my head were a spring of water and my eyes a fountain of tears. I would weep day and night for the slain of my people. Wow. What a sad message that he spoke, and what a hard life he lived. He wanted to resign. Imagine that. But was compelled to speak the truth. And we read this verse earlier where he said, if I say I will not mention his word, it's like a fire shut up in my bones. I'm weary of holding it in. I must speak it. He witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem and the beginning of the Babylonian captivity. Now, this is important to understand too, that we haven't really mentioned this before. After the Babylonians came in and captured Jerusalem and took people from Israel, took them all captive over in Babylon, there was a remnant of people that were left behind in the land of Judah. There was a remnant of poor Judeans. They were left to care for and cultivate the land. Jeremiah was among the remnant that didn't get taken and exiled out. He was just there in the land, but they were just kind of there and destitute. And so while Daniel, the prophet, was taken over into Babylon, Jeremiah was not one of those ones that went. And we'll see how Jeremiah worked with the remnant and what was going on there. That brings us to the next one. When the remnant wanted to flee to Egypt, they're here, they're saying, well, hey, let's just get out of here, let's go to Egypt. Jeremiah prophesied against it, told them not to do it. Of course, do you think they listened? Nope. He, in turn, was forced to go with the remnant to Egypt. He was forced to go along with them. And here's the end of his life. He died in Egypt. Tradition says that he was stoned to death by the remnant that fled to Egypt. So, not an easy life. Not an easy life. I always think of that. There's a song that sometimes used to be sung at ordinations, the ordination of a minister. It's the song, maybe you've heard it before, So Send I You. And the words are like, so send I you to labor unrewarded. And it's all these things that will be happening. I'm sending you to endure all of these hardships. I think of that song sometimes when I think of the life of Jeremiah. So, well, let's go through the outline here. There's a lot to cover. And again, I am not going to really do justice to every single chapter. This is a flyover. And so there's a lot of details, interesting things that we're not going to cover, but I think you can get the main message of what Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, is about. So, we begin with the call of Jeremiah. So, I want to read this. Now, this is a little bit of an extended passage here, Jeremiah 1, verses 4 through 19. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as prophet to the nations. Alas, sovereign Lord, I said, I do not know how to speak. I am too young. But the Lord said to me, do not say, I am too young. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord reached out his hand and touched my mouth and said to me, I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. The word of the Lord came to me. What do you see, Jeremiah? I see the branch of an almond tree, I replied. The Lord said to me, you have seen correctly, for what I am watching to see, that my word is fulfilled. The word of the Lord came to me again. What do you see? I see a pot that is boiling. I answered, it's tilting towards us from the north. The Lord said to me, from the north disaster will be poured out on all who live in the land. I am about to summon all the people of the northern kingdoms, declares the Lord. Their kings will come and set up their thrones in the entrance of the gates of Jerusalem. They will come against all the surrounding walls and against all the towns of Judah. I will pronounce my judgment on my people because of their wickedness in forsaking me and burning incense to other gods and in worshiping what their hands have made. Get yourself ready. Stand up and say to them whatever I command you. Do not be terrified by them, or I will terrify you before them. Today I have made you a fortified city, an iron pillar and a bronze wall to stand against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, its officials, its priests, and the people of the land. They will fight against you, but will not overcome you. For I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord. So that was the call of Jeremiah. And so the Lord called Jeremiah to a very, very difficult ministry. I mean, I just can't imagine living in that time. All the tide is pushed against you, but yet he is called to stand against the current and to speak the truth in a wicked generation. So the next part here on your outline there, you'll see the condemnation of Judah. So you have, this is chapters 2 through 25. Now, I'm just going to go through and make some bullet points of what happens in this time here. And there's some interesting things that are put in here that you can, that I'm not going to be able to cover every one of these, but this is where you can read this and for yourself and get the full accounting of this. Okay, so Jeremiah 2, 1 through 3, 5 is Jeremiah is pointing out that Judah sinned willfully. It wasn't an accident. And then he mentions that Judah is to be judged. And this is prophecies against the southern kingdom, against Judah. He takes some time then in chapter 7 through 10 to point out the hypocrisy they had in their worship, where they just reduced it to a ritual, or they had done some things that just looked very worshipful, but yet they were not living according to justice and honesty in their own lives. Then Jeremiah takes some time to show that how Judah had breached the covenant between themselves and God. So you'll see here, he's taken a long time. What he's doing, he's spelling it all out. Look, this is the deal. If when God sends his judgment, it wasn't like he just made a snap decision here. So the next one is, I'm going to put this, it says Judah's revived relationship. I think that is a mistype there. I should have put reviled relationship because that chapter there is more talking about God's judgment and comparing Judah to a worthless piece of cloth that's been rotted. So it's this. So it's not a revived relationship; it's a reviled relationship. Then there was a terrible drought, and then an intercession by Jeremiah that is recorded in chapters 16 and 17. Then you have Jeremiah's unmarried state. We talked about that earlier. Where this is even the fact that Jeremiah's own family life pointed to the truth of God. This is the sign of the potter's house. Now, this might be a familiar one here. Oftentimes, prophets used object lessons, or God had the prophets use object lessons to get their point across. And so, this was the potter's house. And so, God compared Israel like a potter that would start to make a dish or some kind of a pot or something like that, that if he starts it and then it gets warbled or messed up, it doesn't work, the clay doesn't turn out the way they want it to, what does he do? He mixes it up again and starts again and begins to form the pot again. And so Jeremiah is comparing the nation of Israel. This isn't turning out the way I was trying to form you, God is saying. And so we're going to mix the clay up again and start again. And then later on, Jeremiah smashes a pot, a jar, and saying, look, you're going to get smashed. You're going to be destroyed here. So there's the sign of the potter's house. Now this next one here is a message against Judah's kings. Jeremiah just spells out the evil things that the kings are doing and turning away from God. Then there is a message against false prophets. Jeremiah was a true prophet of God. There were a lot of false prophets. We see false prophets today that they look good, they sound good, they draw a crowd, but they don't tell the truth. And here is Jeremiah telling the truth. And so then you have the 2 baskets of figs. This was, my understanding is this was pointed at the remnant. You had the you had a good basket of figs and a bad basket of figs. The good basket of figs represented those that went off into Babylonian captivity. God was going to protect them there, even though they were taken off into exile. The bad figs were the ones representing the ones that were wanting to flee over to Egypt, the remnant that was left back. So another object lesson there. He talks about the 70-year captivity. And so this was the condemnation of Judah. So all of these bullet points here, he's spelling it out. He's making it clear. And I remember, when I was growing up, it was kind of a funny thing. I'd quote my father every now and then when he wanted to make something real clear to me. He'd say, don't do such and such, and I would forget, and I would do such and such, and I would spill something or mess something up, and his quote was, "I told you, I even showed you." He would say that again, and there was one time when I was an adult that I got to turn that phrase around and tell him that one time. "I showed you, I even told you." Well, God could very clearly say to the Israelites, to the nation of Judah here, "I told you and I showed you." And there is no reason that they shouldn't understand what's going to be happening to them. So that brings us to the next heading here, which is the conflicts of Jeremiah. That's chapters 26 through 29. So this is just talking about some of the things that happened to him in his life where he had a conflicts with leaders and things. And so he had a conflict with the nation, and that's chapter 26. People not listening to him. He had a conflict with some of the false prophets, with all the false prophets, I should say, where he would speak and you'd have others saying a message that wasn't true. He had the true message, but yet he was persecuted for telling the truth. And then these next two chapters, I probably should just lump this together. These two people here, these names, those are two other false prophets, but he calls them out by name, and there's a confrontation between Jeremiah and these false prophets. And so there are some conflicts that he has that are spelled out. Now he skips forward and then he kind of goes back. So now he is skipping forward and making some predictions about the future. I like to think of it this way. He's interjecting some hope in the midst of a very difficult message here. So he is talking now, he looks forward to the future restoration of Jerusalem. The restoration of the land, the restoration to the land as they would be able to come back. The restoration of the nation as they would be able to form their government once again, and they would after 70 years. The rebuilding of Jerusalem. You might remember we looked at that under Ezra and Nehemiah as they rebuilt Jerusalem. And then also under their ministry, the reconfirming of the covenant. Jeremiah is looking to the future that these things are going to happen. We're going to interject a little hope in the middle of these horrible prophecies or horrible predictions that were breaking the prophet's own heart. So he interjects some hope, and then back to reality. We talk about the present fall of Jerusalem. And so he has some messages to some different people and different groups. He speaks to Zedekiah. He speaks to all of the people of Judah. He speaks to a group called the Rechabites. They were a separatist groups of Israelites, and he just spoke to this particular group, had messages to them, and again, warning about the fall of Jerusalem. And then there was the message of the scroll. This is fascinating. Jeremiah had a message written on a scroll to be delivered to Jehoiakim. And you know what the king did? The king took the message on the scroll and burned it. He canceled it. I guess today he would have deleted it. And he had nothing to. Well, Jeremiah rewrote the message again. So you can see the climate in which he is, where he is warning them, and they are shunning the message and shunning him. So then there are some events that take place before the fall of Jerusalem. Jeremiah has some interaction with Zedekiah. Then the king throws him into a dungeon. He talks. Then there's another conversation between Jeremiah and Zedekiah. Jeremiah is then thrown into a cistern, and then there's another conversation with. So, again, this poor prophet. There is no wonder we call him the weeping prophet. And you see now why he's been given that name. So this is the next thing here. It's the events that happened during the fall. Jerusalem falls. Jeremiah is released, and he is not made to travel to Babylon with the rest of. He stays back. And then there's a man named Ebed-Melech who is rewarded. He had helped Jeremiah earlier, and so he is commended for what he had done. He had helped Jeremiah, so there was one little bright spot there in his life here. So, but this is all during the fall of Jerusalem. And then we have, after the conquering of Jerusalem, we have messages after the fall. Chapters 40 through 45 is Jeremiah's ministry to the remnant in Judah, and then his ministry to the remnant in Egypt, because he ended up going there. So you can see how his life went. Hopefully this is kind of spelling this out here. And don't worry, the book of Lamentations is really short, so we'll get through both of these tonight here. So then Jeremiah turns his prophetic message to the Gentile nations. And you see here on the screen there is a list of all the different nations. He calls them out and lists out their sins. And so you've got Egypt, Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Edom, Damascus, Kedar and Hazar, Elam and Babylon. And so then we have another review here of the fall of Jerusalem, and that's in Jeremiah 52, the capture of Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem, the exile to Babylon, and then there's a record of Jehoiakim, who is in Babylon, that records that he was shown kindness while he was there. That's a sign of hope. Again, that the people who were in exile would survive this, and they would come back, or the people would come back and one day re-inhabit Jerusalem, and they did. So there's Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, and so he writes another book, and it would stand to reason that he would be the one who would write a book of laments, the book of Lamentations. So Lamentations is the 25th book in the Bible, but it only has 5 chapters. So we'll just take about 45 minutes on each chapter, and we'll make it through here on time. So there's this. It's written by Jeremiah, and it's just expressing his sorrow at the fall of Jerusalem and the plight of his people. Let me move to the next one here. You can see the other part here. And now 5 chapters, and we're going to talk about how these chapters are laid out. It's kind of interesting, actually. This outline has it, Jeremiah chapter 1, he mourns for the formerly beautiful city. And then chapter 2, God's anger is expressed. And then Jeremiah expresses the depths of despair and the heights of hope and faith. And then chapter 4 is further imagery and hope in God. And we'll take a look at this a little bit more in detail. Now, let's look at some of the key verses. I'm going to leave this on a large screen for y'all that are watching at home here. I chose 2 key verses out of Lamentations. Chapter 1 and verse 1. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. The lament of Jeremiah. And then there's some hope and a prayer. Restore us to yourself, Lord, that we may return, renew our days as of old. And that's in the 5th chapter of Lamentations. So let's move around here, move on to some of the background about Lamentations. Okay, so the background here, first of all, on your outline there, if you want to write this down, the word lament means to cry out in grief and deep sorrow. So if I'm lamenting, that means I have grief and deep sorrow, and this is a book, Lamentations is a book of laments. And so that is a form of literature. And so it was interesting that how we read from 2 Chronicles where Jeremiah had written a lament for the passing of King Josiah. And so that was just a way that you would write, you would express your grief. And so they mentioned that he had written that at some point. So now this is interesting here. I've got an outline on the screen here of how this looks here. Lamentations contains 5 poems. So each chapter is a poem, and each chapter, except the middle chapter, contains exactly 22 verses. So each chapter, each chapter is written as an acrostic using the Hebrew alphabet. So if we're using the English alphabet, verse 1 would start with the letter A, verse 2 would start with the letter B, verse 3 down to 26 letters. That's how many is in our alphabet, right? So in the Hebrew alphabet, there's 22 letters. So each chapter has 22 verses in it, except for chapter 3, the middle one, because the third chapter contains an acrostic containing triplets of verses. So 3 verses together, and each of those triplets of verses begins with another letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So you've got 66 verses in the middle. So it's got a very strict poetic structure to it. So I thought that was an interesting fact to know about the book. So let's just go on about the outline of Lamentations. And really, this is just Jeremiah pouring out his heart and expressing his grief. The first one we see here is Lamentations chapter 1, and he laments Jerusalem's condition. We read one of those verses from the first chapter there. The city of Jerusalem is remembered in the use of such words as, you were once great among the nations, the splendor of the daughter of Zion, treasured as in the days of old, but now you're in ruins. And so this is lamenting the condition that we see Jerusalem in. And so then the second chapter, 22 verses, is an expression, a recording of God's anger. The anger of the Lord is expressed in such words as, the Lord has cast a dark shadow over beautiful Jerusalem. Again, this is written in poetic form as well. And the result of God's anger is expressed in such words as you can find in verse 17. The Lord has done what he planned. He has fulfilled his word, which he decreed long ago. He has overthrown you without pity. He has let the enemy gloat over you. He has exalted the horn of your foes. God's anger is recorded in that second chapter. And then that brings us to chapter 3, and this is Jeremiah's grief. Jeremiah describes his grief and his sorrow in very intense terms. Verse 4 is a good example. He said, He made my skin and my flesh grow old. He made my skin and my flesh grow old, and has broken my bones. I think it's interesting that phrase there, how stress can age a person. You've probably seen over the years, each president that comes along, they take a picture of them their first day in office and then their last day in office, and my goodness, don't they age quickly. Or if somebody goes through an extremely stressful period of life, you can see a physical change. And Jeremiah is expressing that. My flesh has grown old. He saw the beautiful city of Jerusalem being destroyed. But even in the midst of this unimaginable grief, Jeremiah expresses gratitude for God's grace. We read here in verse 22, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. In the midst of the grief, there's always some hope sprinkled in here. So then chapter 4 is Jerusalem's fall. God's anger is described in the chapter as so great that those killed by the sword are better off than those who die of famine and racked with hunger. It'd be better that you just be killed quickly than deal with the pestilence and things that's going on in the city. They waste away for lack of food from the field, and we kind of looked at some of those verses earlier. And then I called this last one Jeremiah's plea, chapter 5. Jeremiah calls upon God to remember the people in their state of ruin. He confesses, however, that the Lord reigns supreme from generation to generation. He never makes a mistake in his judgments. And so Jeremiah is expressing his grief. He's processing these feelings that he has, and he's throwing them out there. So you can see the historic events, you can see the prediction of it, and then you can see the emotion that comes behind it. And these people, hopefully Jeremiah is a person that has come to life. And you can see this is a real living person who bled, who hurt, who grieved, who had great sorrow, and who dealt with difficulties in life. And so there's the outline there. And so, wow, we're going to get finished plenty on time here tonight. So let's just look at two simple applications from Jeremiah and Lamentations. The first application comes from the life of Jeremiah himself. God honors those who stay faithful in proclaiming God's word in spite of suffering and rejection. Jeremiah had a hard way to go in his life. I just can't imagine what he dealt with in his life. The persecution and just the physical toll it must have been, the grief, the heartache he was going on, and just to never have a convert. There had to have been days that he said to himself, what's the use? Why am I doing this? These people won't listen. But the reason he was doing it, God was giving his people every opportunity to turn back over his long ministry. I just can't imagine what it would be like to bring a message from God to the king, and the king would cut it up and burn it. What in the world? How do you recover from something like that? But Jeremiah soldiered on, and he was faithful. God honors those who stay faithful. We look at his life today, I don't think anybody would consider him a failure. If you were taking measurements of ministry, they would say, well, how many converts did you have? 0. The measurement that God uses is how faithful were you? And Jeremiah was faithful to the end. Last one here, national deterioration and disaster are the result of disregarding and disobeying God. And how can we say this? Some people would say, well, wait a minute, isn't this just about Israel? Well, you'll notice that there are several of those chapters there where all of those nations were listed out. God wasn't just looking at the nation of Israel and her sins. God did judge the sins of the other nations. One day Babylon would be destroyed. One day all these nations would be overthrown and things would come about. And there were times when God would send prophets to foreign nations to warn them of coming judgment. That's what the whole book of Jonah is about. And so God does look at people, and he sometimes brings disaster on people, whether it be the nation of Israel or other nations. And so Israel was set apart, and in some ways, if you look at it, Israel would have been more guilty than the other nations, because they were given something special. They were given the Word of God. They were given the law to know themselves. They were given that record, And so they, having witnessed that, they would have been more guilty than the other nations that only knew the pagan ways. But so national deterioration, disaster are the result of disregarding and disobeying God. And Israel saw that. And even Nineveh, who repented for a while in the days of Jonah, eventually they went back to their old ways, and God ended up having them. They were destroyed as well. And so we disregard God and we disobey God at our own peril, as our societies do. It took many, many years, but finally God sent his judgment on the nation of Israel. But I think the biggest thing, as I look at Jeremiah, I am inspired by his faith in spite of the trials that he faced.